weary foot led another for what seemed like an age as he travelled across the endless plains of tarmac. Slowly, he wound his way closer to what had been his destination for years. It had never dawned on him just how big the world was until he was forced to return to walking. The option of any other transport had been eliminated within the first few weeks, before he had ever really even had time to comprehend how desperately he would need it. That didn't really matter now. The end of his desperate pilgrimage was in sight, and at long last, he may be able to stop walking. The idea of letting both feet rest together once again was an appealing thought, though it gave him little joy. Joy had faded from the world with so much else as it slowly began to decay, rotting and breaking down with every passing moment, leaving behind only relics of what had come before, the remnants of a civilization so full of promise, reduced to ruins, statues that few could tell the meaning of. Those who still remained kept to themselves the majority of the time. On occasion you'd see a small group shuffle past, eager to be rid of you quickly as possible. Once he'd seen a man stop as he passed a small group. Only once. They had seemed different to most, better off, moving with some idea as opposed to the aimless wonder most possessed. He could have sworn he'd seen a look of pity behind the bush of dry hair that covered the man's face, but it hadn't lasted. They had scarpered as quick as the rest when he pulled the rifle off his back. He stopped suddenly as he noticed the darkness about him that had meant he'd strolled into a shadow. Raising his head and pulling back the hood from his face, he saw the enormous metal plate standing over him, a sign rusted nearly beyond recognition, but to him it was unmistakable. It meant that his quarry was exceedingly close. He felt a small hint of pride. Despite all that had happened, the unlikelihood of success at the end of his journey, he had managed to follow the plan. He had dragged himself the length of the country through the sick waste, and had finally reached his destination. It was an achievement beyond what he thought was possible. He hoisted his pack, felt for the soft piece of faded metal that hung about his neck, and began to wander towards the glinting silver peaks that towered before him. It wouldn't be long now. The tall towers that marked the entry to what had previously been a city loomed over him. They leant over to peek at the little creature who shuffled by at their feet. The buildings had become increasingly curious over the years, the men patrolling the streets below becoming ever less frequent. The city made for an odd sight. Huge masses of glass and steel, taken over by vast amounts of undergrowth. Trees sprung up from every crevice, crowding together and creating enormous pools of dark shade. Vines and woody roots wove their way in and out of shattered windows. The parks had become nearly untraversable, the grass reaching up above the height of a man. The weary traveller knew better than to attempt walking through them, knowing what might be lurking inside. Occasional spots of colour brightened his slow journey. He stopped to stare at the rare patches of wild flowers which emerged from walls and the cracks between paving slabs, their delicate petals filling him with a small and dangerous tincture of hope and a frail cheer. He crept on towards where he was eventually heading. His huge round pack made walking a slow process, made even slower by the fact that with every small sound, scattering of birds or crash of falling concrete, he would stop. Quickly rushing over to anything that would suffice as cover and crouching behind it, pulling his poncho over most of his small figure and moving his loose scarf up to cover his face, leaving a gap just large enough for his eyes to peer through. He then slowly pulled his rifle to squeeze against his shoulder and rested the barrel on top of whatever rubble was currently providing him safety. It was unlikely to encounter them anymore. Most had seemed to have gone away from the populated centres, moved underground or died off. He wasn't sure. They still terrified him. Even the mere thought that one could be close by was enough to send a deep and piercing fear running through him. Only when the silence had been festering for a good long while did he emerge once again, allowing his rifle to slide down to his hip, his eyes still flickering, then finally moving on once more towards his laboured goal. A wiry smile appeared across the cracked and crusty face of the traveller as he looked up to see a street sign which hadn't quite given itself up to corrosion. He was nearly there. His pace increased to enthusiastic swiftness before he realised himself. It would be a cruel ending to be taken so close to his goal. He had been walking for such a long time. He forced himself to remain alert. Pulling his rifle closer into his shoulder, he squinted more vehemently into the cracked and broken ruins of a building on either side of the road. At an achingly slow pace, he turned into a street lined with gargantuan houses, reaching up into the sky above, the clouds slowly clearing as if wary of the great concrete pillars. His figure was dwarfed by their crumbling vastness as he made his way down the street. Like weary skeletons, they watched him scuttle by through hundreds of empty eye sockets. A vague glint came from several hundred yards up the road. The ending of his journey finally came into sight. The shape of a great metal stallion grew as he edged closer. The weight of his destination loomed heavily over him. There was no guarantee after all this time. He had only been clinging on to the hope of a small possibility to keep him going. His aim had always been so far off that it hadn't mattered whether or not it would prove futile. It had kept him moving, kept him living. He approached, ever so slowly, ever so surely. The huge empty space of the square in which the horse centred grew around him. With a swift motion, he swung his rifle round to the rest upon his shoulder once again. There was less danger of them coming here. They hated the light, and if one ventured out, he would have enough time to take aim before it reached him. He walked up to the base of the statue and laid a wrinkled hand upon it. The softened stone felt warm under his touch, welcoming. He shuffled round the back where the service ladder was to be found and began to climb. Somehow, after all these years of decay, it held its weight right to the base of the great horse. He took it to be a good omen. He stood vigilant from his new position of height. From here he could see the entire length of each of the streets which led off the square. With a sudden vigour, he crawled around each of the beast's great legs and scanned every inch within sight for a sign. The symbol they had chosen so long ago. There was nothing to be found. A writhing pain and choking fear gripped him suddenly, like a flood washing over the fragile shore of his constitution. He slumped down against the hind leg of the creature he had once thought to be lucky. Cold drops of water ran down his face, the salt burning in the crack of his lips. With a shudder, he pulled his poncho over his withered frame and laid his rifle across his lap. After all this time, he settled down and began to wait.